Although Christians tend to emphasize the monotheism of the Hebrew Bible from the earliest time up until the later period, it appears, according to scholars, that there was a development in Israel and the understanding of one God. In this podcast, we have a Jewish scholar who comes to discuss this development, and then we make application to consideration of how we should understand our own Christian faith better by looking more carefully at the sacred text. And then secondarily, when we make apologetic arguments or critiques of other religions that believe in more than one God, our arguments need to be more nuanced and better defined. So we hope you enjoy this edition of the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged to have it today as my guest, Dr. Kenneth Seeskin. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Very good. I'll read a little bit of his bio, and folks can look in the description of the podcast for his complete bio and some other links. Dr. Seeskin is the Philip M. and Ethel Klutznick Professor Emeritus of Jewish Civilization. After receiving his PhD from Yale in 1972, he joined the faculty of Northwestern and has remained there ever since. He served for nearly 20 years as chair of the philosophy department, and with the start of 2010 to 2011 academic year, he served as the chair of religious studies. He has won several teaching awards since coming to Northwestern and served as the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence from 1995 to 1998. He is best known for his interpretation and defense of the rationalist tradition in Jewish philosophy, including such figures as Maimonides, Spinoza, and Cohen. His most recent books include the Cambridge Companion to Maimonides, Maimonides on the Origin of the World, Autonomy in Jewish Philosophy, and Searching for a Distant God, the Legacy of Maimonides. And folks can, again, look to the program notes for a further expansion. Is there anything you want to add to that, Dr. Seeskin?
Yeah, you could add, I have a big soft spot for Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so I even have a necktie. I didn't wear it with the writing of Thomas Aquinas on it. So Aquinas read Maimonides, we know that. And I have to say, when I read Thomas, is one of the thinkers where bells go off. So I haven't published a book on him, but he has a pretty good place in my heart. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you for adding that. By way of background as to why we're having this conversation, I am a regular reader of the Torah.com, which is a great resource for folks if they want to see how Jewish scholars are interacting with the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, and in all kinds of different ways. And there was an article that came up, I'm not sure when you wrote it, but it came up in my email feed, titled, "When Did the Bible Become Monotheistic?" And it's a great read. And as I mentioned before we started recording, I often connect the dots between my ongoing attempts at understanding the Hebrew Bible, Judaism, my own Christian faith, with the process of multi-faith engagement, multi-faith encounters. And I have seen, and I'll make some comments at the end, I've seen some Christian apologetic efforts at drawing upon the monotheism of the Bible and then making apologetic arguments and critiques against other religious traditions like the Latter-day Saints or Mormons. And in my view, many times that apologetic kind of misses the mark in terms of being better informed about the development of monotheism within the Hebrew Bible. So Dr. Seeskin will help us unpack that today during our conversation. I'm going to kind of follow the outline of, I'll put a link in the program notes to that article you wrote at thetorah.com. But I'm going to be following kind of that basic structure of the article that you wrote there. And if I'm missing something, you can certainly help me fill in the blanks here. You begin in the article with a discussion of numerical monotheism and philosophical monotheism. Can you define these and how it relates to this discussion?
Well, numerical monotheism basically says there is only one deity, It's a numerical claim. And it's not altogether clear, by the way, when that develops in the Hebrew Bible. We can go into that a little bit later in more detail. Philosophical monotheism, though, is a little bit different. And that says that God, yes, there's only one, but that the one that there is special, is in a class by him, her, itself. So let me give you an example that I hope will clarify this point, okay? Let's suppose that someone, let's say in ancient Greece, take that as an example, and suppose somebody believed in the sole divinity-ship of Athena. We'll make it a woman, okay? So this person believes that Athena is the only god there is, or goddess, if you will, and she appears in human form. She wears battle armor and human clothes. She talks to human beings, involves herself in the Trojan War, just the way Homer describes it. Now, here's the question. If you believed in the sole divinity-ship of Athena, or anybody, Poseidon, Zeus, it doesn't matter. If you believe in the sole divinity-ship of a pagan god or goddess, does that make you a monotheist, as Judaism, Christianity, or Islam understand the term? Another way to phrase this would be to say, is there a distinction to be made between monotheism, properly so called, and single deity paganism, which is what I've tried to describe? And it seems to me there is that true monotheism is more than a numerical claim. It's at least a numerical claim. I'd say it denies that. It's at least that. But there has to be more to it to be genuinely monotheistic. And what more to it is, again, this God is special. This God is not just a glorified human being. This God does not wear human clothes. This God is, we need special categories to describe this God. In fact, this God may even be ineffable. We'll have to see. But it's more than just arithmetic. If you want a simple way to think of it, the arithmetical claim is there's only one. The philosophical claim is uniqueness, not just one, but in a special category, unlike anything else. And so I would say that to be a true monotheist, you have to assert both. And if you go through the Hebrew Bible, they develop in different forms at different times. But it takes a while for these two to come together so that we have monotheism as we now would come to understand it. I hope that's clear. If it's not, you're free to object. You're free to follow up questions. If the president can take follow up questions, so can I. So shoot, go ahead.
No, that's very helpful. I just want to make sure listeners and viewers understand. Many times in the Protestant Christian tradition, this idea that why just go to the Bible, but even just with this first question, we're not just looking at the text, we're looking at the text through a number of lenses, including philosophy, philosophical theology. So that's correct. That's what we're doing, correct?
Right. So, I mean, look, let's take an example. If you look at the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord thy God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. Now, question, does that mean there are other gods, but I don't want you to worship them? Okay. Or does it mean I am the only one? And if I'm the only one, okay, we have numerical monotheism, but then we're told you can't make an image of this. Well, why can't you? Is it that you could make an image of God if God wanted you to do so? God has a human form. Or is it that God is not the sort of thing that you can make an image of? God has no visible or tangible form. The Hebrew Bible doesn't answer those questions, at least not originally when they occur in the book of Exodus. It leaves us guessing. It's not altogether clear that we have monotheism even at Mount Sinai. It's not altogether clear that Moses was a monotheist in our sense of the term.
So again, there's a development there. Now you have also referenced in the article, and you gave a mention of it in your first response, to anthropomorphism in relation to God.
Right.
And here again, many Christians that they look to the immateriality of God, and they have various explanations for the anthropomorphisms, their theophanies and metaphorical language and this kind of a thing. But you reference the work of Stephen Sommer in this regard. And hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly there. Those really aren't good. Isn't there a development in the understanding of the nature of God in relation to anthropomorphism, just as there is monotheism?
First of all, the Hebrew Bible is full of anthropomorphisms, loaded with them. Both Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas realize that and say so. The question is whether we interpret them literally or whether we take them metaphorically to be making some other point. So let's take a few examples. The book of Genesis says Noah walked with God. All right. Does that mean Noah walked with God in the way that, say, you and I would walk down the sidewalk to the store? Is that what it's trying to say? Or is it simply saying Noah was beloved of God? Noah walked in God's ways in the sense of doing what God wanted. Well, I would argue for the latter. I would argue that, sure, this is a nice expression. The Bible, let's keep in mind, is a literary text. It isn't a textbook in theology. And so it uses metaphors, parables, descriptions, all like that all the time. You've got to be careful with literal interpretation. Did Moses see God face to face? Well, the book, the Hebrew Bible says, unlike any other prophet, Moses spoke with God face to face. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that he's two people face to face in the way that they're talking at Starbucks over a cup of coffee? Is that what it's trying to say? Or is face to face a metaphor, meaning that God's revelation to Moses was clearer than anyone else's? It didn't occur in a dream, that when Moses received it, he was in full possession of his faculties. In other words, what are we trying to say? When the book says that God saw something, did God see it with eyes the way you and I would? Or does it simply mean that God realized or knew something? Again, every time you see an anthropomorphic description, I would say it's always the case, if you think about it, it's trying to make a larger point about the sovereignty of God. It isn't necessarily saying that God takes on human form. Now, qualification. It's a long and complicated text. You got to be careful. Exodus 24 says the elders of Israel did see God. The prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, says that he saw God. The prophet Ezekiel says he saw God in human form riding on a chariot. Okay, so there are passages where it's not completely clear that monotheism has developed yet, and there's some of the greatest prophets who ever lived. So I don't want to suggest everything is clean cut and it's straightforward from the beginning. So you have passages where people say they did see God. On the other hand, you have passages where God says, no, you didn't see me. And you have passages that say, don't try to make an image of God. So there isn't a single line of development. It takes a while for these various inconsistencies or apparent inconsistencies to be resolved. That's a long-winded answer that I apologize for.
No, that's great. I
But,
think
the subject of anthropomorphism is in the Bible, is debated. There's still scholars today who debate it, and there are passages that do seem to suggest God either does or can take on human form. Those passages, I think, are there. But I think in the long run, both Judaism and Christianity, Islam, the Abrahamic religions have moved beyond.
okay. That's very helpful. I don't expect you to give me a Reader's Digest answer to, these are very complex. For folks who still know what Reader's Digest is.
Yeah, there is a book by Benjamin Summer, which is, I think, the book you referred to.
Yes.
And he said, look, the evidence for God having a physical form or a body in the Hebrew Bible is overwhelming. Well, I wrote a reply.
Okay.
In one sense, it is overwhelming. The question is whether you want to insist on literal interpretation all the time. And I would say, no, we don't have to. I mean, look, let's take another example. Suppose I said to Shakespeare, let's take Shakespeare as an example. Suppose I said, Will, get rid of all the metaphors, Will, you've got to be completely literal in everything you say. So don't tell us the world is a stage. It's not literal. I mean, we want straight scientific literalism all the way through. Well, we wouldn't be reading him if that were the case. All great literary writers use it. They should use metaphors. The human mind thinks metaphorically, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I'm not, in no sense am I critical. Even science uses metaphors, for heaven's sake. So just every time you see one of these passages, my only advice is slow down. Ask yourself what the passage is really trying to say. What is the context of the passage? What point is this passage trying to make? And does it absolutely require you to ascribe anthropomorphic features to God? That's my advice.
Okay, that's very helpful. In regards to this question of a development of monotheism, against the background of Israel within the ancient Near East, I think many times there's a need to try and recognize the context of the ancient Near East so that Israel fits within that, and yet it's also at the same time trying to do something new over the course of its history. Can you talk to how the development of the belief in one God among many is a facet that fits within the context, but yet Israel comes to understand through its experience that there's something different and unique about Yahweh?
Well, okay. The usual way to look at monotheism is to say that Abraham was the first monotheist. Okay. And we refer to the Abrahamic faith, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Bible doesn't tell us a thing about what Abraham believed about God. We know he was loyal to God. I'm not denying that for a second. Did he believe that his God was the only one, or did he believe that his God was the most powerful among, let's say, a whole pantheon of gods? We don't know. No, nobody knows. Nobody, because we're not told. There are legends that have sprung up about Abraham, but the actual text doesn't tell us. When the Israelites are saved at the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea. The Israelites cross on dry land. The Egyptian army comes and is drowned. And there's this it's called the Song of the Sea. Great song of triumph and jubilation. And there is a little a passage in there that became a canonical prayer in Judaism. If you were to interpret this literally, it says, "Who is like you among the gods?" Plural. Who is like you among the gods? Well, now wait a minute. That suggests that the God who rescued them at the Red Sea is one, the most powerful, the most exalted, the one to whom they owe the greatest loyalty. But that not only does it not deny the existence of other gods, it would seem to assert it. Okay, so it takes a while for Israel to sort of come to grips with how special this is. And I would argue that the first true monotheist is the second Isaiah, the prophet. Now, footnote, three different people wrote under the name Isaiah. And this was quite common in the ancient world. People would write under the name of their master or the leader of their school or sect or whatever. Quite common. Truth to tell, we don't know the real name that second Isaiah had. The first monotheist is in some sense nameless. Okay, but he makes two claims. The first claim is, "I am the first, I am the last, and besides me there is none else." He's talking in God's name. And I repeat, "I am the first, I am the last, and besides me there is none else." That gets rid of the pantheon. Okay, that we now get clarity. We now have only one. We have numerical monotheism and all the rest. But then he makes a second claim. "To whom will you liken me that I should be compared?" All right, now let's think about that. To whom will you liken me that I should be compared? This says God is comparable to nothing. Not the mightiest army in the world, not the strongest hurricane or earthquake. God, as I said at the outset, is in a class unique to God. There is nothing that resembles God. God is wholly unlike everything else. And this is what I've termed philosophical monotheism. Second Isaiah makes both claims. Now, if God is unlike anything else, if God cannot be compared to anything at all, then think about what we're saying. That's why you can't make an image of God. Because once you make an image of God, you're comparing God. You make an image of God as a lion, or as a human being, or as a lightning bolt, or take your pick, you would be comparing God to something on earth. And second Isaiah says, no, God is comparable to nothing at all. So I am crediting second Isaiah with being the first monotheist. I wish I could tell you more about his life or his name. I wish I could tell you where he lived, what he had for dinner, or what his likes and it. We just don't know. But these are the two claims, and they're there in the text as clear as can be. Now, again, you could argue it takes all three traditions time to develop the full implications of these claims. And I'm certainly sympathetic with that. But I would say this is sort of the landmark. This is where somebody puts his foot down and says, from now on, this is what we have to hold.
Do we know enough about the time period in which second Isaiah might have been writing, and or if not about the individual, about the experiences of other Israelites? that
The
might have led to this
Yeah, first
monotheism?
Isaiah is writing before the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586 BC. After the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem, destroy the temple, Persia conquers Babylonia. And the great king of Persia, Cyrus, allows the Jews to go back and to rebuild the temple. So we get the second temple. Second Isaiah is most likely a prophet of the restoration. He is most likely a prophet of the generation who was allowed to return. And what he says, in addition to his theological statements, he tells the people, God is not angry with you anymore. You have paid whatever a debt there was in terms of your sins before God. God has forgiven you. You can go back now and rebuild. We can start over again. It's very much a hopeful, optimistic prophet. And then we get the theology, and the theology is unlike anything, or let's put it this way, much clearer, much more precise about the issue of God than anything that went before. Before we have ambiguity, and I would say now we've got the two foundations, the two pillars upon which this doctrine rests.
So is there putting it in again in its context, is there a something of a radicalness, a qualitative difference between what we see in Second Isaiah and, for example, some have compared the development of biblical monotheism to, I think it was the pharaoh Akhenaton, and his was an elevation of one deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Was it not?
I don't know enough to speak with expertise about that. I mean, look, even in ancient Greece, Zeus occupies a position on Mount Olympus that is superior to all the other. They have to bend to the will of Zeus. Is it monotheistic? Not really. Let's keep in mind that Zeus has to bend to the will of the fates, so he's not all powerful. Let's keep in mind that Apollo once got the fates drunk, so they're not all powerful. So I would say you don't, certainly not in Greece. It really isn't monotheism that I would call. The Egyptian case, I just don't know enough about, and I'm not sure we have enough record of what was actually stated to decide that one way or the other.
Okay. How does how do these statements in Second Isaiah, how is that then picked up and carried forward into the Hebrew Bible and Israel's ongoing understanding of the nature of God?
Well, you still have the numerical claim from that point on stands, I would say. The problem, the second claim, the uniqueness of God, is still fought over. Okay, and the reason for that is that you face a very serious problem. If you say that God is comparable to nothing, that's the second claim. Well, then what are you going to say? How do you describe something that's comparable to nothing at all? Okay, so as things develop, I would say you have a tradition, the rabbinic tradition, starts to soft pedal this, and they've got plenty of passages that are anthropomorphic in rabbinic literature. God wearing clothes, God suffering and going into exile with the people, God experiencing emotions, God having all kinds of attributes, physical attributes. In that sense, Summer is right. The tradition is not clear-cut monotheistic. Along comes the philosophical tradition in Judaism, which starts around the 10th or 11th century and reaches its high point in Moses Maimonides, the 12th century. And he takes second Isaiah's insight to its logical conclusion. And this is a conclusion that not everyone likes, and to this day is still controversial. I like it, but okay, let me explain. He says that God is ineffable. No, this is Maimonides now. No human praise, no human description, no is adequate to the full glory and perfection of God. In other words, he says, God is, if you want to think of it this way, God is off the chart of anything that we're or anything else is on. So he ends his discussion with the following claim, and this is where people have trouble with him. He quotes the 65th Psalm, and the 65th Psalm says, "Silence is praise to thee." Silence is praise to thee. Now, what does this mean? That God is so unique, so special, so unlike me or anything else in the created order, that the best thing I can do is to approach God with a feeling of awe and a studied silence. Because any description I start to make will compare God to something down here, and the second we do that, we miss the point. Okay, that's a pretty strong claim to make. You can see why he would make it. He quotes second Isaiah. He says he's giving you the full implications of second Isaiah. But there are a lot of Jewish scholars, rabbis, practitioners who would say, wait, this is just going too far. It's going way too far. What do you mean silence is praise to thee? What about the prayer book? Isn't that full of praise of God? Well, Maimonides would say, yes, it is, and you should read the prayer book, and you should read all of the praise that we give to God, but you should then, in the last analysis, see that it falls short. It's still human categories. It's still our descriptions. It's still something that we can grasp and we can get our head around. And the second that you say we can grasp it and get our head around it, Maimonides answers, then you don't have God. Because God is greater than anything we can get our head around. So this is still a highly controversial claim. And I would say that Maimonides is in the minority. Now, I'm with him 100%. And here I have to talk about, I am a Jew, and I'm comfortable with being in the minority. I have to tell, it's a personal point. It's no longer theology or biblical criticism, but the second that the majority of people agree with me, I get nervous. I get that something is not right. So if you tell me, even in my own tradition, that I have a minority voice, I'm very comfortable with that.
Well, that is music to my ears, because I am often a minority voice crying in the wilderness in my own religious tradition. So I appreciate where you're coming from.
I think Thomas Aquinas didn't get quite that far. In fact, at certain passages, he says he thinks this would, if Maimonides was right, this would leave the average person standing in church confused and befuddled, and well, it does, and it would. I mean, Aquinas is right about that. And yet, as I read Aquinas, if you read him closely, I think he's actually closer to Maimonides than he's often characterized to be. Not quite as extreme, but I think he is certainly sympathetic with what Maimonides is trying to say.
Well, I want to make application to the focus of this podcast. But before I do that, your article gives a summary of some of the important issues and the elements involved. It's multi-layered, it's complex, there's agreement and disagreement among scholars and rabbis and so on. It's a tall order, but can you kind of summarize the issue in that there is, in your view and the view of many others, there is a development in the Hebrew Bible, starting at one place, I don't know if we want to call it henotheism or what have you, to monotheism. Can you just summarize
Yeah,
that?
I mean, look, again, we don't know what Abraham's theology was. We don't even know if he had a theology, for heaven's sake. When we get to Moses, who's often called one of the first monotheists, well, as I said, you look at the commandments that Moses gives us. He doesn't tell us why we can't worship gods other than the God of Israel. He leaves that we can't, but he doesn't tell us why. So there's a big question mark there. And he doesn't tell us why we can't make and worship an image of God. Leaves that completely open. So we're not altogether sure what his theology was. Again, if he even had a well worked out theology. So you have passages in the Torah that say people saw God, and then you have passage of Deuteronomy at the end of the Torah that says no, they didn't. So the text itself is not completely clear. This may represent different authors and different groups, the way they saw things, but we don't have a clear-cut doctrine at the end of the Torah. As I said, even first Isaiah says he saw God, and God had a robe and a left side and a right side and angels up on top. Is that monotheistic? Doesn't sound like that to me. So yeah, I mean, if you look at everything there before Second Isaiah, the return to Jerusalem under Cyrus, it's the sort of thing that keeps scholars in business because of the inconsistencies, the ambiguities, take it this way, take it that way. It keeps people like me in business commenting on this. And so for the average person, if you pick it up and read it and say, well, now where do we stand? The answer is we don't know. It's still debatable. Now, as I said, once the philosophic tradition gets going, you get precision, but you get the extreme version of what monotheism means. And you've always had in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam an anti-philosophical counter movement, claiming that the philosophers basically don't have it right. This is a question of simple faith. We don't need all this philosophical analysis and precision. Okay, so all three traditions, I would say that you still we still have ample room for disagreement over what monotheism is really about. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, in a way, let me try to put an optimistic spin on it if I can, okay? Religion isn't geometry. It shouldn't read like a geometry test. You know, if you read Euclid, there's no ambiguity. You know exactly what you've got. You have absolute demonstrations of every theorem. If you if you disagree with the conclusion, it's because you don't understand. There is no real room for debate, disagreement, shades of ambiguity, etc. I don't think religion works that way, and I don't think it should work that way. Okay, there should be room for different traditions, even within a single faith. There should be a philosophical tradition, an anti-philosophical tradition. There should be a historical tradition. There should be a literary tradition. So the way I see it, if you want to make sense of the Bible, I see a table with maybe 6, 8, 10, 12 people representing different disciplines or different historical epics sitting around talking about these texts. And they aren't always going to agree, and they shouldn't always agree. So as I said, I'm willing to live with disagreement, and I'm willing to live with opponents. And sometimes I learn from them. Sometimes I think they're crazy. But okay, religion isn't cut and dried, and it shouldn't be. I think it would be a big mistake to reduce it to something like geometry.
Well, I am very comfortable with that, and that's part of what we try to do this podcast. Unfortunately, many conservative Christians don't like a whole lot of ambiguity, tension, inconsistency. We like the black and white, and it's good to hear that it's okay, and the biblical text itself includes this. And in order to understand it, we need to bring diverse approaches to it.
All right,
Uh,
let's play in your ballpark for a minute, okay? We're
let's do
playing
that.
in your ballpark. How about the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus comes and says, I've come to fulfill the law. Okay, I've come to fulfill the law. And so I raise the question, did he mean, A, I've now fulfilled it and therefore you don't have to, which based on what he says, you could read it that way. Or did he mean, I've fulfilled it and you now have to follow me. I've shown you what complete fulfillment of the law looks like. And therefore, you have to do your best to emulate what I've done. Which one did he mean? On the basis of the speech alone, I don't see how you. I read it in Greek. I read it in the original. So in the just if you look at the speech and even how do you decide what he meant? Okay. And this was a sermon. This was not given to professional scholars or theologians. This was given to regular people. And yet, when we go back over it centuries later and read it, you could take it either way. And it would make a big difference to how you understand Christianity, depending on which of these interpretations you want to hold. As I said, either of them can be supported.
Yeah, I no argument here for me.
Now, if he comes back, we can ask, okay, what exactly, could you give us a little more clarification on how we should understand the Sermon on the Mount? But as of that hasn't happened yet, and just on the basis of the text, we don't know.
Mhm. Well, one closing comment for me or thought for me, and if you have some comment one way or the other, that'd be great. If not, that's okay too. The reason why this is two reasons why this is of such interest, I think it should be to others in the Christian tradition, is one, we need to understand the biblical text, the Hebrew Bible better, and maybe our very black and white understanding the Bible is monotheistic from the very beginning. Maybe that needs to be rethought just to understand our own tradition, to understand Judaism better. And secondly, we're using the biblical text to bring disagreement and critique to other religious traditions that aren't monotheistic, or at least not in the sense that we think they should be. And maybe our arguments could be better. So I think that we have good reason, great motivation to understand the biblical text better, not only for our own understanding, but also as we relate to others in other religious traditions. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, you and I apparently are cut from the same cloth here, how we view that we need to understand that the sacred literature of both the traditions leaves room for interpretation, further study, questioning. These are not bad things; they're good things. To look at these texts. And by a critical mind, I don't mean trying to disprove it or something. What I mean is trying to go through the scholarly literature and trying to see what alternatives there are and what choices we have to make for ourselves. This is all to the good. This is all to the good. When you read these texts, they're not cut and dried. It's not like picking up the newspaper and reading about a murder investigation where you get complete literal statements, factual statements, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4 down the line. They don't read that way. They shouldn't read that way. They reflect the historical climate in which they were written. They have literary devices. They make theological claims. So the thing here, when you read sacred literature, open your mind. Open your mind to what it's trying to tell you. I try not to criticize other traditions. There are religions that are not monotheistic. It's not me. I'm not a follower, but I don't like to pass judgment on the rituals or the literature traditions of faiths outside my own or even outside the Western tradition. So, we have enough trouble within the Western tradition. So let's keep it there.
That's very true. Dr. Seeskin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation and responding positively to an email inquiry from somebody you didn't know out of the blue and being willing to come on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. This was a fun time. I thank you for inviting me. This was a nice way to spend the afternoon.
Well, again, this is the podcast for Multifaith Matters. Please look to the program notes for more of the bio and links to the books by my guest today, as well as some links to some other places you can go and continue to explore this particular topic. I would like to thank everybody for listening and viewing. Until the next episode of the Multifaith Matters podcast.